I never should have taken the job. That much was clear the moment I stepped foot inside the cabin. The pay was good, too good, and I was desperate. It started with an online listing, a month-long gig, house-sitting a cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. The owner, a retired professor, was traveling out of the country and needed someone to maintain the property, keep an eye on things, and report any issues. The job sounded perfect. Seclusion didn't bother me. In fact, I welcomed it. I had no family waiting for me, no pressing obligations back home. A month away from the noise of everyday life seemed like a gift. The drive took nearly 10 hours, and as the roads thinned and the last signs of civilization faded, I realized just how alone I would be. The last hour was nothing but dirt roads lined with thick trees, the sky disappearing behind the canopy. My car's tires crunched over gravel as I made my way up the winding path. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly as it had in the pictures. 2 stories, wood-paneled, a wraparound porch that faced a small clearing. But something felt different, like the weight of the forest was pressing in on it. I stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of old wood and something else I couldn't place. Musty, maybe. The professor had left everything as promised. Stocked pantry, firewood, a detailed set of instructions on how to keep the place running. He had even left a handwritten note on the kitchen table. "Welcome. You'll find everything you need here. The land is quiet, but keep an eye out for any changes. If anything seems off, document it. See you in a month." At the time, I didn't think much of the wording. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time reading, walking the property, listening to the sounds of the forest. The only visitor I had was a single deer that wandered too close one evening, its dark eyes reflecting the cabin's porch light. Nights were darker than I expected, the kind of darkness that swallows everything. I had never been anywhere so far from artificial light. Even with the moon out, the trees blocked most of it, leaving only small patches of silver on the forest floor. Then, things started changing. Small things at first. On the 4th day, I woke up to find the front door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. I checked every window, every room, but nothing was missing. Just the door hanging slightly open, as if someone had gently pushed it after I had gone to bed. A few nights later, I heard noises outside. Not animals, something else. A shuffling, deliberate. I sat up in bed, listening. The floorboards of the porch creaked. I held my breath, straining to hear past the sound of my own heartbeat. After what felt like an eternity, the noise stopped. I convinced myself it was just the wind or maybe a raccoon. I forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside. Not boot prints, not shoes. Bare feet. Human. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost, wandered too close to the cabin. But the nearest town was hours away, and there were no trails nearby. I checked the locks twice that night. I kept the fire stoked, the warmth making me feel safer. The following days, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I started noticing more signs. Small things moved inside the cabin. My book on the armrest when I was sure I had left it on the table. The kitchen chair slightly pulled out when I knew I had tucked it in. I kept a knife within reach at all times. I started setting little traps, placing an empty coffee mug on the doorknob, a stack of firewood balanced against the door. If anything moved, I would know. One morning, I stepped outside and saw something that made my stomach drop. A small pile of rocks, carefully stacked near the porch steps. 5 stones balanced one on top of the other. They hadn't been there the day before. Someone had placed them there during the night. I took a picture with my phone and kicked them over. That night, I hardly slept. I kept the lights on. I listened, and then, just past 3 in the morning, I heard it. A voice, not close, not right outside, but distant. From the woods, a single word. "Hello." It was soft, almost questioning. My breath caught in my throat. My body went rigid. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, some trick of the wind. But I knew better. The next day, I made the decision. I would leave. I packed up my things, grabbed my keys, and walked outside. My heart hammered in my chest as I reached my car. I unlocked it, threw my bag in the passenger seat, and got in. The engine didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. I opened the hood, though I didn't know what I was looking for. And then I saw it. Wires cut clean. Deliberate. Someone had done this. Panic set in. I ran back inside, bolted the door, grabbed the gun the professor had left in the drawer. I sat there, back against the wall, gripping the handle so tightly my knuckles turned white. The day passed in slow agony. The sun dipped behind the trees. Darkness crept in. I heard them again that night. Footsteps circling the cabin, slow, patient. A single tap against the window, then silence. Morning came, and with it a sickening realization. The professor knew. The note, the strange wording. Keep an eye out. Document any changes. This wasn't just a house-sitting job. I spent the next hours reinforcing the doors, searching for anything that could help. I found a radio, ancient but working. I sent out a distress call, hoping anyone would hear it. By nightfall, they were back. More of them. I heard their breathing, low and steady. A hand pressed against the window, fingers smearing across the glass. And then, a voice. Come out. I gripped the gun, my mind racing. I had one option. Wait for daylight. Try to make a run for it. The hours stretched endlessly. They never tried to break in, just waited, watching. Then, just before dawn, an engine, a truck, headlights cutting through the trees. A voice, real this time. Sheriff's department. Anyone inside? I nearly collapsed. I stumbled to the door, flung it open. A deputy stood there, hand on his holster. His eyes scanned the clearing, then settled on me. They sent me to check on you. Got a distress signal. I turned back. The footprints were gone. The smears on the glass wiped clean. I didn't ask questions. I got in his truck and we left. I never looked back. A week later, I got a call. The professor. His voice was calm. You did well, he said. They didn't take you. I hung up. I changed my number. I never went back. But sometimes, at night, I wake up to the sound of footsteps outside my window, waiting. The cabin was exactly as the listing described. Isolated, surrounded by miles of trees, and completely off-grid. That's why I chose it. I wanted time away from everything. No emails, no work calls, no noise. Just me, my thoughts, and the stillness of nature. The drive there had been long. The last few miles were nothing but dirt roads cutting through thick forest. My tires kicked up dust that lingered in the air behind me. I kept the windows rolled up despite the summer heat. Something about the woods felt dense, heavy, like they swallowed sound. My car's engine seemed too loud, the tires crunching over gravel, an unwelcome intrusion. When I reached the cabin, I took in its simple structure: weathered wood, a small porch, and a stone chimney. It sat in a clearing just big enough to let the sunlight break through. A narrow, overgrown trail led into the trees behind it. The place looked untouched, like it had been waiting for someone to disturb it. I unpacked quickly, just a duffel bag with clothes, a few books, canned food, and a rifle. I wasn't worried about people, but I wasn't stupid either. I'd read about mountain lions in the area. I had no plans to be caught off guard. The first night was peaceful. I sat on the porch, listening to the woods. The quiet was deep, not silent, but deep layers of sound stacking on top of each other. Crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. I fell asleep easily. The bed was old but comfortable. No traffic noise, no humming electronics. Just the natural dark, the kind that city life never really allows. I felt safe. That changed on the second night. I had spent the day hiking, following the trail behind the cabin. It twisted through the forest, leading to a small stream. The water was cold and clear, moving lazily over smooth stones. I filled my bottle, sat on the bank, and let my mind wander. Hours passed without me realizing. When the sun dipped lower, I made my way back, reaching the cabin just as the light faded. I made dinner, just beans and bread, then sat on the porch as the sky turned black. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. I was just about to head inside when I heard something. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not the random sounds of the forest shifting. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving through the undergrowth just beyond the tree line. I held my breath. The steps stopped. The woods were too dark to see anything beyond the first few feet of trees. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I forced myself to stay still. After a few minutes, I stood, grabbed my rifle from inside, and stepped off the porch. "Hello," I called out. Nothing. I listened, waiting for movement, for a voice, for anything. But the woods had gone dead silent. No crickets, no wind, just an awful, thick stillness. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day, I searched the tree line. I found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe my mind had twisted normal forest sounds into something human. That night, it happened again. This time, I was inside, reading by lantern light. The footsteps were slower, closer. I turned the lantern off and moved to the window, pressing myself against the wall. The porch creaked. I gripped the rifle, barely breathing. Then, nothing. No retreating steps. No sound at all. I waited for what felt like hours before finally flicking the lantern back on. The clock showed it had only been 20 minutes. I checked the porch. Empty. I stepped off, shining a flashlight into the trees. Still nothing. I locked the door and sat on the bed, rifle across my lap. Sleep didn't come easy. By the fourth night, I was exhausted. The footsteps returned, circling the cabin. I couldn't take it anymore. I yanked open the door and fired into the darkness. The sound exploded through the night, echoing through the trees. Then silence. I stood there, heart hammering, rifle barrel still hot. My ears rang in the quiet. I knew I had hit nothing. I would have heard it. I locked the door and stayed awake until dawn. I left the next morning. I didn't pack neatly. I shoved everything into my bag, threw it in the car, and peeled out of there. I didn't care if I left something behind. When I finally reached town, I stopped at a diner for coffee. My hands were still shaking. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, poured me a cup and smiled. "Must be staying out near the old logging roads," she said. I nodded, too tired to answer. She sighed, shaking her head. "They always come back rattled. You're not the first." I swallowed hard. "Who?" She just gave me a tired look. "Whoever's been out there." I didn't ask anything else. I didn't want to know. I just drank my coffee, paid my bill, and drove home. I haven't gone back, and I never will. I should have known better than to go up to the cabin alone. I told myself I could handle it. A week of quiet in the mountains, just me, some books, and a chance to reset my mind. No distractions, no people, no noise, just silence and fresh air. It sounded perfect, but I should have known. The drive up was uneventful, just long stretches of road with nothing but trees on either side. The last few miles were on a narrow dirt path, winding and steep. My old truck rattled over the loose rocks, and I made a mental note to check the tires when I got there. If I blew one out, I'd be stranded. No cell service out here, That should have been another warning. The cabin belonged to an old friend of my father's, some guy I barely remembered. He had let us stay in it once when I was a kid. I had vague memories of that trip, chilly mornings, the smell of damp wood, my father chopping firewood. It had been a good trip, but now, seeing the cabin again as an adult, something about it felt off. The wood was darker than I remembered, the windows coated in a thin layer of grime. It looked tired, forgotten. I stepped onto the porch and tested the key in the lock. It took a few tries before the door gave, creaking open to reveal a musty interior. Dust floated in the air where the sunlight streamed through the windows. The furniture was basic: an old couch, a wooden table, 2 chairs. A fireplace sat cold in the corner, and the kitchen was just a counter with a small stove and sink. I set my bag down and did a quick sweep of the place. The bedroom had a single bed with a thick wool blanket draped over it. The bathroom was tiny, just a toilet and a shower stall with a plastic curtain that clung to my arm when I brushed past it. The air inside the cabin was stale, the kind of smell that clung to abandoned places. I opened a few windows, letting in the crisp mountain air. That first night, I fell asleep fast. The drive had worn me out, but at some point I woke up. It was pitch black inside, not even a sliver of moonlight through the windows. I wasn't sure what had woken me. The cabin was silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. I lay there listening, my heart picking up speed. Nothing, just my own breathing. I turned onto my side, telling myself I was being paranoid. Then I heard it, a faint creaking, like weight shifting on the old wooden porch. My chest tightened. I listened harder. Maybe an animal, a raccoon or something, but the sound was too deliberate, too slow. A single creak, then silence. Another creak. Someone or something was stepping carefully, testing their weight. I held my breath. My truck was the only vehicle for miles. No one else should be up here. I sat up slowly, my fingers gripping the blanket. Then, after a long stretch of silence, I heard the sound again, this time from the side of the cabin. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, the small beam slicing through the darkness. My boots were by the bed, but I didn't put them on. I moved to the window, keeping the light off. Peering through the dirty glass, I saw nothing but trees, just shadows and the faint outline of my truck. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, waiting, listening, but the sound never came again. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an animal and went back to bed, though I didn't sleep well. The next day, I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks. The ground was too hard, but I did find something that made my stomach knot. The padlock on the shed behind the cabin was hanging open. I didn't remember if it had been like that when I arrived. The shed door was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness inside. I stood there for a long time, staring at that open door. Then, gripping the flashlight, I pushed it open. The inside was cluttered. Old tools, a rusted saw, a pile of wood stacked against the back wall. Nothing seemed out of place, but that didn't mean much. I backed out and shut the door, securing the padlock. I didn't like the idea of someone else having been here. The second night was worse. I woke up again, but this time, I knew exactly what had woken me. The sound of footsteps inside the cabin. My blood turned to ice. I stayed completely still, my ears straining. The sound had come from the other room. Slow, deliberate steps, the soft creak of wood bending under weight. I gripped the flashlight and slowly reached under the bed, where I had tucked my hunting knife. My fingers closed around the handle, my pulse hammering. I listened, barely breathing. The steps moved again, closer this time. I flicked on the flashlight and aimed it at the bedroom doorway. Nothing. The cabin was empty. The front door was still locked. The windows were still shut, but I knew what I had heard. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake, knife in hand, listening. The cabin groaned in the wind, but I heard no more footsteps. By the time the sun came up, I had made my decision. I packed my bag, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. But when I stepped onto the porch, I stopped cold. My truck, the hood was open. I stood there for a long moment, dread creeping up my spine. I had checked the truck yesterday. The hood had been closed. I forced my legs to move, stepping off the porch. When I got closer, my stomach dropped. The engine had been gutted. Wires torn out, battery missing. Someone had made sure I wasn't going anywhere. A sound behind me made me spin around, knife raised. The cabin door was swinging shut, as if someone had just stepped inside. I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran down the dirt path, my lungs burning. I had no phone, no way to call for help. My only chance was to reach the main road, hope for a passing car. Behind me, I swear I heard footsteps. Fast, heavy footsteps. Someone chasing me. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital. A hiker had found me collapsed by the roadside, dehydrated and delirious. The police went up to the cabin. They found my truck, found my things, but no sign of anyone else. The only thing out of place was the shed door. It was open again, the padlock missing. They never found out who had been up there, but I know someone was, and they had been waiting for me. Started as a favor. My coworker, Dan, had booked a remote place up in the woods for a week, but had to cancel last minute due to a family emergency. He didn't want the reservation to go to waste and asked if I wanted to take it. I had nothing better to do, and the idea of a quiet, isolated break sounded good. The cabin was far too far, a solid 3-hour drive from anything that resembled civilization. The last 30 miles were on a dirt road full of potholes and narrow turns. I drove slowly, watching the sun dip lower behind the trees, the shadows growing long and thick. I didn't like that I was arriving at night. Something about approaching an unfamiliar place in the dark felt wrong. The cabin was small but sturdy looking, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. It had a front porch, a single window facing the road, and a shed out back. The keys were under the welcome mat, just as Dan had said. When I stepped inside, it smelled of old wood and dust. The interior was simple: a couch, a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bedroom with a creaky bed. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just absolute silence. I unpacked and made a quick dinner, trying to ignore how unnatural the quiet felt. No distant traffic, no hum of electricity, just the occasional rustle of leaves outside. As I ate, I noticed the back door had a thick wooden bolt across it, much heavier than the flimsy lock on the front door. The windows, too, had old wooden shutters that could be latched shut from the inside. It made me wonder why someone would need that much security in the middle of nowhere. That first night, I slept terribly. The mattress was stiff, but it wasn't just that. It was the feeling of being watched. More than once, I swore I heard something moving outside. Not an animal, something bigger. A slow, deliberate crunching of leaves. Every time I sat up and listened, it stopped. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. Nothing seemed disturbed, probably just my imagination. I spent most of the day hiking, trying to shake off the unease. The woods were thick, and it was easy to lose my bearings. There were no trails, no markers, just endless trees. A few times, I got the eerie feeling that I had walked in a circle, even though I had been going straight. Then I found something strange. Deep in the woods, where the trees grew close together, I stumbled across an old structure. It wasn't quite a cabin, more like a shack, long abandoned. The roof had partially collapsed, and the door hung off its hinges. I stepped closer, curiosity getting the better of me. Inside, There were scraps of furniture, old cans, and a torn sleeping bag in the corner. Someone had been here once, but not recently. The odd part was the carvings. The inside walls were covered in deep scratches, almost like tally marks, running from floor to ceiling. Some were fresh. I ran my fingers over one, feeling the raw edges of the wood. That was when I heard it, a branch snapping. Close. I turned, heart pounding, but saw nothing, just trees and shadows. The silence pressed down on me, thicker than before. I left fast, making sure to keep my direction straight. I walked quicker than I had all day, my back crawling with the sensation of unseen eyes. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was setting. I bolted the doors and latched the shutters, trying to ignore how paranoid it felt. I told myself I was overreacting, but deep down I wasn't so sure. That night was worse than the first. The noises came again, closer this time. I was sure I heard footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, listening. Then a sound came from the back door, a soft, testing push against the wood. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the fire poker and stood in the dark, heart hammering. The sound stopped. Minutes passed. An hour. I didn't move, barely breathed. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under again, but it was restless, broken sleep. Morning light brought no comfort. I checked outside, half expecting to see footprints, but the ground was undisturbed. I almost convinced myself I imagined it. Almost. That day, I stayed close to the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I caught glimpses of movement between the trees. Not animals, bigger. Then I saw it, a figure, standing between the trees, too far to make out details, but unmistakably human. Just standing, watching. My mouth went dry. I forced myself to turn away, to pretend I hadn't seen it, and went inside. I locked everything again, my hands shaking. I wanted to leave, but the thought of driving that long, dark road at night was worse. I barely slept, but I knew when it started again. The footsteps, slow circling, then tapping soft, deliberate on the walls. Not the doors, the walls, like someone running their fingers along the wood, testing it. My chest tightened. I gripped the fire poker, my breath coming too fast. Then a sound from the shed, the door creaking open. I had locked that door. I was sure of it. The footsteps moved again, slower this time, as if whoever or whatever. It was new. I was listening. I stayed frozen, every muscle locked. The minutes dragged, then finally silence. I didn't sleep after that. I sat awake, gripping the poker, waiting for the sun. At first light, I grabbed my bag, threw everything inside, and left. I didn't care about breakfast. I barely locked the door behind me. The drive back was a blur, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I never told Dan what happened, never told anyone. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear the tapping again, and I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed just one more night. I don't know why I ever thought it was a good idea. I was just looking for some peace and quiet, a break from work, the city, everything. The cabin was perfect for that. Secluded, no Wi-Fi, no cell service. Just trees, a lake, and the silence I thought I wanted. I found it online. Cheap rental, barely any reviews, but the pictures looked nice. It wasn't too far from town, maybe an hour's drive. The idea of being alone for a weekend seemed perfect. I got there late in the afternoon. The road leading to the cabin was just dirt and gravel, barely wide enough for my car. Trees pressed in from both sides, blocking out most of the sunlight. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was starting to set. The place looked just like the pictures. A small, one-story wooden cabin with a porch and a view of the lake. There was an old wooden dock stretching out over the water, and the trees lined the shore thick and dark. No neighbors, no sounds except the wind in the branches. Inside, it was basic but comfortable. A small kitchen, a living room with an old couch and a wood-burning stove, and a single bedroom in the back. There was a bathroom, too, with an old shower that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. The whole place smelled like dust and wood, a little damp, like it hadn't been aired out in a long time. I set my bag down, checked the kitchen. No food except some old cans in the cupboard. I had brought enough groceries for the weekend, so I wasn't worried. The first night was uneventful. I sat on the porch, drank a beer, watched the lake. The air was cool, and the sky turned dark fast. No city lights out here, just the moon and the stars. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I was used to the hum of traffic, distant voices, sirens. Out here, there was nothing but the occasional rustling in the trees. Probably animals. I tried not to think about it too much. Eventually, I went inside, locked the doors, and went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was pitch black. My heart was pounding, and I had that strange feeling, you know the one, like something isn't right, like you're being watched. I lay there for a while, listening. The cabin creaked now and then, settling, but nothing else. No wind, no rain, just silence. Too much silence. I told myself it was just being alone in an unfamiliar place. It messes with your head. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I found something strange. Near the edge of the porch, in the dirt, there were footprints. Not mine. I had only worn sneakers since I got there, and these were barefoot prints. Human. I stared at them for a while, trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone had been passing through? A hiker? But why would they walk barefoot out here? And why so close to the cabin? I checked the door, still locked. Windows, too. Nothing was missing. Maybe I hadn't noticed them when I arrived. I pushed it out of my mind. I spent most of the day fishing at the lake. It was peaceful. The water was still, except for the occasional ripple from a fish breaking the surface. I tried to relax, to shake off the weird feeling from that morning. The sun was warm, and for a while I actually enjoyed myself. But then I started noticing things. Small things. Across the lake, where the trees were thick, I kept thinking I saw movement. Just little glimpses, something shifting in the shadows. Every time I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, the way the light moved through the branches. That night, I double-checked the locks before going to bed. I don't know why. Nothing had really happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I lay in bed, listening again. At some point, I must have drifted off. A noise woke me, a soft scraping sound. My eyes snapped open, heart hammering. It was coming from outside, near the porch. Then it stopped. Silence. I held my breath, listening. Maybe an animal? A raccoon? I told myself that, but I didn't move. Just stayed there, staring at the ceiling. Then came another sound. A slow, deliberate creak, like weight shifting on the wooden porch. I sat up, barely breathing. Someone was out there, just standing, waiting. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever. Then I heard it, the doorknob rattling. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, no signal. I had no weapon, nothing to defend myself with. My car keys were in the other room. The rattling stopped. Then footsteps, slow, moving away from the door around the side of the cabin. I slipped out of bed, heart pounding in my throat, and moved to the window as quietly as I could. I pulled back the curtain just enough to see outside. There was someone standing at the tree line. Not close enough for me to see clearly, but close enough. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing the cabin. Watching. I stayed like that for hours, barely breathing. Eventually, as the sky started to lighten, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sun was up, I grabbed my bag, my keys, and got the hell out of there. I didn't bother packing properly. I just stuffed everything into my bag and left. The whole drive back to town, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling never left me. That I had been watched, that someone had been right there, just outside, while I slept, that they had tried to get in. I never reported it. What would I even say? No crime was committed. No proof. Just footprints, a rattling doorknob, and a figure at the tree line. Maybe it was a drifter. Maybe just some lunatic living out in the woods. I don't know, but I do know I'll never go back. I'll never stay in a cabin alone again. The drive up to the cabin was longer than I remembered. I hadn't been there in years, but the winding roads through the thick forest all looked the same. My tires crunched over gravel as I turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the place. It was deep in the woods, miles from any town, and even farther from anyone who would hear me if I screamed. I wasn't scared, though, just tired. It had been a long week, and I needed a break. I wanted solitude, fresh air, and the kind of sleep that only comes when the world around you is completely silent. The cabin belonged to my uncle. He had built it himself back in the 80s, and since then, it had been passed around between family members whenever someone needed a weekend away. He hadn't been here in a while, though. The last time I saw him, he said he was done with the place, claimed the isolation wasn't good for him anymore. I didn't ask why. He always was a little off, so I figured he just got tired of it. I parked and stepped out. The air was sharp with the scent of pine, and the cold bit through my jacket. It was late fall, the kind of season where the trees were mostly bare, and the wind cut through them like knives. The ground was damp, scattered with rotting leaves and patches of mud. The cabin itself looked the same as it always had. A single-story structure with a slanted roof, a porch that sagged slightly in the middle, and a door that never quite fit its frame. It wasn't much, but it was sturdy. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust and old wood. I flipped the light switch, and the bulbs flickered before holding steady. At least the power still worked. The cabin had only the basics. A small kitchen with an old gas stove, a living room with a couch that smelled like mildew, a bedroom with a creaky bed, and a bathroom that took forever to warm up. It wasn't luxury, but I wasn't here for that. I just wanted to be alone. I dropped my bag in the bedroom and started unpacking. I had brought food, water, a few books, and enough firewood to last the weekend. The plan was simple: read, hike, sleep. Nothing more. The first night was uneventful. I made a quick dinner, read by the dim light of the lamp, and fell asleep early. The silence was comforting. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity. Just the wind outside, rustling through the trees. Then, around midnight, something woke me up. It was a noise, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. I sat up, heart hammering. My first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, or a bear. But it didn't sound like an animal. It was too deliberate, too steady. I stayed still, listening. The sound continued for another minute before stopping abruptly. Then, nothing. Just silence. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing happened. Eventually, I lay back down, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind, maybe the house settling. I didn't know, but I was too tired to care. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately saw it. A trail. A long, deep trail in the dirt, leading from the woods to the side of the cabin. I followed it with my eyes, my stomach twisting. The ground was disturbed, as if something heavy had been dragged. but there were no footprints, no sign of what had made it. I walked around the cabin, scanning the area. Nothing seemed out of place. The woods were still, the morning air cold and sharp. I shook it off. Maybe a fallen tree branch had been moved by the wind. Maybe an animal had dragged something during the night. There had to be an explanation. I spent the day hiking, trying to push the thought from my mind. I walked for miles, letting the fresh air clear my head. By the time I got back, the sun was setting, and the chill in the air had deepened. That night, I locked the door, not because I was scared, just to be safe. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the hike, but I didn't stay asleep. At some point in the night, the noise came again, the same dragging sound, closer this time. I shot up in bed, every nerve in my body on edge. The sound was right outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening. Then a new sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the porch. I reached for the flashlight beside my bed and clicked it on. The thin beam of light barely cut through the darkness. The tapping continued, slow, deliberate. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then silence. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I wasn't sure. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the window, and I finally exhaled. When I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. The dragging marks were back, fresh ones, leading from the woods to the porch. And on the wooden steps, deep in the grain of the wood, were scratches. Long, uneven scratches, as if something had been clawing at the door. I didn't hesitate. I packed my things, locked the cabin, and left. I never told my uncle what happened, never told anyone, but I never went back either. And sometimes, in the middle of the night when everything is quiet, I still hear it. That slow, steady dragging. I pulled off the main road onto a narrow dirt path, the kind that didn't look like it had seen a car in years. My tires crunched over the gravel, the trees swallowing up the last bit of daylight behind me. It was late October, and the air had that sharp chill that clung to everything, even inside the car. The rental agreement said the cabin was about 2 miles in, tucked away on private land, far from anyone else. That's what I wanted. I wasn't running from anything, not exactly. Just needed space. A break from the constant hum of people, the obligations, the pressure to always be doing something. I figured a week off the grid would be good for me. No work emails, no phone calls, no notifications. Just me, the quiet, and maybe some hikes. The deeper I drove into the woods, the more the road seemed to dissolve under my tires. It went from gravel to packed dirt, then to something barely recognizable as a road at all. I had to slow to a crawl to avoid the potholes and jagged rocks. Branches scraped the sides of my SUV, their skeletal fingers tapping against the windows. I checked my phone. No signal. I expected that, but seeing it confirmed made my stomach twist a little. Finally, the trees thinned out, revealing the cabin. It was smaller than I expected, just a single-story structure with a slanted tin roof. The wood was dark, weathered. It had a porch, but the steps looked warped, like they'd been there too long. The single window at the front reflected the fading light, making it impossible to see inside. I killed the engine and stepped out. The cold hit me immediately. It smelled like damp leaves and dirt, with something else beneath it. An old, musty scent, like wood left to rot. The forest loomed all around, thick and tangled, the kind of place where sound didn't travel far. I listened for birds, for the rustle of small animals. Nothing, just the wind pushing through the trees. I grabbed my bag and walked up the steps, each one creaking under my weight. The door was locked, just like the owner said it would be. I fumbled with the key, my fingers stiff from the cold, and pushed it open. Inside, it was basic. A single room with a small kitchenette, a wooden table, and a couch that looked as old as the place itself. A door to the left led to the bedroom, another to the bathroom. The air inside was stale, the kind of stillness that only came from being shut up too long. I dropped my bag near the couch and walked over to the fireplace. There was wood stacked beside it, dry and ready to burn. At least the owner had taken care of that. I got a fire going, the warmth slowly creeping into the room, then turned on the battery-powered lantern I brought. The cabin had a generator, but I didn't feel like dealing with it yet. I sat on the couch, listening to the fire crackle, watching the shadows shift along the walls. The quiet was thick, pressing in from all sides. It felt different than I thought it would. Less peaceful, more empty. I shook it off. I was just tired from the drive. After heating up a can of soup and eating it straight from the pot, I decided to turn in early. I walked into the bedroom, my lantern casting long, wavering shadows along the wooden walls. The bed was plain, just a mattress and some scratchy-looking sheets. As I set the lantern on the nightstand, something creaked outside. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Just the wind, I told myself. The trees shifting, settling. But I walked to the window anyway, peering out through the dirty glass. Nothing, just the forest, dark and endless. I climbed into bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin, and closed my eyes. A sound woke me. I wasn't sure what it was at first. A thump? A scrape? I lay there, ears straining against the silence. The fire in the other room had burned down to embers, its glow barely reaching the bedroom. Then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate creak, like weight shifting on the porch. I sat up, heart hammering in my chest. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer, but something felt wrong. Animals didn't move like that. Step, pause, step, pause. I reached for my lantern, flicking it on. The weak light pushed back the dark, but it didn't make me feel any better. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, moving as quietly as I could. Another creak, closer this time. I stood, bare feet pressing into the cold floor, and took slow, careful steps toward the window. The glass was fogged with condensation, but I could make out a shape. Not an animal, person, standing just beyond the porch, barely visible in the weak light. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of their body. They weren't moving, just standing there watching. A spike of fear shot through me, sharp and cold. My brain scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was the owner, checking on the place. Maybe a lost hiker. But no one would be out here this late, and they wouldn't just stand there. I backed away from the window, my breath coming too fast. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand. No signal, no way to call for help. The boards creaked again. They were on the porch now. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a fire poker from the fireplace, and moved to the front door. I pressed my ear against the wood, straining to hear. Silence. I reached for the deadbolt, making sure it was locked. My fingers barely brushed the metal when, bang, the door shook in its frame. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. My breath came in ragged gasps. Another bang, harder this time. The whole cabin seemed to rattle with it. I gripped the fire poker tighter, my knuckles aching. My mind raced. Do I stay? Try to run? There was nothing but miles of forest in every direction.
No neighbors.
No help. The third bang sent the door cracking inward, splinters flying. The lock held, but barely. I ran to the bedroom, slamming the door shut, shoving the dresser in front of it. My body shook as I pressed myself against the far wall, waiting, listening. The banging stopped. Silence stretched out, long and suffocating. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving away. Minutes passed, then an hour, then two. I stayed awake, gripping the fire poker, listening. Nothing, As the first light of dawn seeped through the trees, I finally moved. The front door was cracked, splintered, but still in place. The porch was empty.
No footprints.
No sign that anyone had been there. I didn't wait to question it. I grabbed my bag, stuffed it with whatever I could carry, and ran to my car. The engine roared to life. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I drove until the cabin was nothing but a bad memory in my rearview mirror. I never went back, never told anyone, but I still wonder, late at night, who or what was out there in the dark watching.